The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Happy holidays as well. Your speaker today is Greg McCarville, and he'll be talking about web components beyond the basics. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them in the top right corner. This will also be recorded, and the video will be provided the following day. So without further ado, I want to introduce Greg.
Hi, Bill. Thanks a lot.
No problem.
Appreciate the opportunity to share. And we're going to be going through this as a second part of a two-part series. So if you're new to Wakanda or you weren't around for the last webinar, there is a previous talk that I did that covers some of the basics. I'm not going to be covering a lot of that today, but I'll give you the link and resources to get there. So let's get started here. And like Bill said, there is a mechanism for typing in questions. If you have questions along the way, feel free to type them in. I'll do my best to answer them as I'm going. The other thing that I want to mention is this is going to be a real casual type presentation. I'm going to pretend that you're sitting beside me at the desk and I'm just explaining to you, a bit more about components. Keep it casual. I do have a good amount of the material put together, so it's going to take a bit of time to get through, but I'll try and go slow enough so that you can follow along. I think because I don't really know the audience, I just wanted to cover a bit about Wakanda. This is one topic, in fact, just one section of a topic about the overall environment of Wakanda, but in general, what you're looking at if you're a new user is it's a full JavaScript stack that's specifically focused on building business web applications. So data-intensive web applications. It has a multi-threaded NoSQL relational data store. Really promotes an agile methodology, which helps you improve your time to market and allows you to build in small functional chunks and always have an application that's usable. It's based on open standards, so CSS, HTML5, and JavaScript. There's a nice client-side framework that's improving, and it provides numerous widgets. There's two licenses available. There's an open source license, so you're welcome to browse the code that makes up Wakanda, as well as there's a commercial license available as well. I'm going to be using Wakanda Studio today. That's a free tool, a development IDE. And like I said, I'm going to be covering only one topic today. So what I'd suggest is if you're new to Wakanda, there's a great community going in the forum. I'd encourage you to get into the Learning Center, learn some of the basics, and start contributing to the forum and make the community that much stronger. So let's get into components. I'm going to recap the basics very quickly. What you should do if you didn't see the first installment of this is you should go to the Wakanda YouTube channel. It's there, youtube.com/user/wakandasoft. And the title of the previous screencast, it's not in the webinar section on the website because we had problems recording the last time. So I did a screencast directly after the webinar called The Fundamentals of Components. And that will go through all the ideas and concepts presented there. So as far as a recap, let's talk about the benefits of components and why you use them. Essentially, the big items that you benefit from is you get to reuse your code and reuse some layouts. You can create a component and use it in multiple places, which gives you more consistency, and it also gives you more modularity. So if you have an application, you can start building it in logical chunks, and they work independently, and it just becomes, in particular for larger applications, a lot more manageable. The other fundamental thing to understand is components have two parts. There's a component widget and there's a web component. Essentially, the component widget is a frame in which you load a web component into. So when I'm talking about components, sometimes I'll refer to the widget, sometimes I'll refer to the web component, and it depends on the context, but together they make up the topic of components. There's the syntax for loading a component. Just wanted to review real quickly. The first one here, just referencing the widget with the $$ dot load component with empty parenthesis. This is if you have the path to the web component specified in the Properties tab. If you want to specify the path on the fly, the second method here is what you want to do. You pass in the path. And we're going to take this a few steps further today. That's the point of the presentation, but there's the basics. So I'm going to go into, let's go into Wakanda Studio. I'm just going to review real quickly the project we did last time. I based it loosely on it for today, but we'll just go to this introduction and I'll run it. So if anyone remembers this, basically what I've done is I've done outlines where I can big, ugly, bold outlines. Like I said, this is not about UI. It's not about design. This is about learning something. So I put big, ugly, bold outlines on component widgets so you can see where they are. If you remove these outlines, a web component will look seamless in your application. You won't really be able to tell the difference whether it's in a component or it's native on the interface page. So in this example, we have 3 views: companies, people, and employees. So the first benefit of components is you can load views in dynamically and no page refresh required. It's basically injecting into the DOM new elements, new functionality on the fly. The other benefit of components, you'll see here I have a category with their service level, and I'm loading in dynamically different package level functionality here. So that's the same concept, loading in dynamically, but what's interesting is if we go to the employees here, you can see when I switch employees, I'm using the exact same widget, or sorry, not widget, the exact same web component in 2 different views. So this is where you can get into, again, creating the functionality one place and using it in different places throughout your application. So that's as far as I'm going to go in the review today of the past session. But again, watch the previous screencast. You'll get a lot of benefit out of that. So that's the basics. Let's go on to the next slide here. So today's webinar, what are we going to cover? We're going to cover a few things, and I'm going to show you this so that, like I said, feel free to ask questions along the way, but this is what we're going to cover. So if your question pertains to any of these, maybe wait until we get to that section before you actually ask the question. First thing we're going to cover is we're going to cover the component lifecycle. What happens when you load a component? What are the steps? What parts of the script get executed at different points? And where are you best to insert your code depending on what you want it to do? We're going to do an overview of the generated code and its execution. So when you create a web component, which was covered in the last talk, there's generated code that's produced by Studio that makes up the skeleton of a web component. We're going to review that. We're going to talk about local data sources versus global data sources. We're going to talk about initializing a component during the onload with user data. We're going to talk about code shared between component instances. So you maybe set a variable that's common amongst all instances of one particular web component. We're going to talk about creating custom functions for a web component and how to execute those. We're going to talk briefly as well about dynamic creation of a component through JavaScript. So starting with nothing and building the component with JavaScript and nothing else. So it gives you a lot of creative flexibility how you're going to build your application using this technique. And then we're going to talk about some best practices of communicating between components, so component to component. Because if you remember from the last talk, one of the main elements that you need to get your head around when you're dealing with programming or using components in general is that you're working within a compartment, you're working within a scope, and there's certain best practices you want to follow, because if you've gone through the effort of creating the component and creating that scope, you want it to be as independent as possible. You want it to be decoupled from your application so you can move it freely. So there's some best practices how to communicate between different components. So let's talk about the life cycle. Now there's some slight modifications to this um, that Choiseul provided to me. It's a very technical difference, so I think this is still valid for 99% of people. So this red dot here represents when you actually start loading a component. So it's just going to go through this cycle. It's going to load the component. First thing it's going to do is it's going to clear and hide the component placeholder. You can actually load into a component widget that already has a web component populating it, and it will replace it. So the first thing it does, clears and hides that component placeholder widget. Gets the components files, so it looks at manifest, gets the files, which is usually an HTML, CSS, JavaScript file that make up the web component. But there can be more files. It generates the widgets, data sources, and shows the component. Then it instantiates that instance of the component. It fires the component's load event. Then it fires the component's resize event. And it calls the component's internal ready method, or sorry, the widget's internal ready method. So this is sort of the life cycle of the onload. I'm going to be showing you sort of in script the different points where you can inject code and what makes sense where. But this is more of the technical background of what's happening. And then on the remove, when you remove a component, it destroys the data sources local to the component. It recursively calls remove component on each of the child components, because you can have nested components, a web component within a web component. Deletes the widgets, removes the component element from the DOM, and then it hides the placeholder. So that's the process. Now I'm going to show you basically how it works in the context of code. So this is the old project, this is the new one. So let's go into lifecycle. And all I've got here is I've got a component widget with, and I'm going to load in a component. And we go into our components folder here. This is where I've kept all the supporting components. By the way, this project is on GitHub. I'm going to share that information with you at the end of the presentation. I'll have it, I've done a commit in its state currently, in the beginning state, and then I'll do a commit with all the code that I've filled in. So we've got a component here, a web component, which is here. And all I've done in the JavaScript is I've just put a bunch of debugger calls so we can see the order in which things happen. So this web component has a grid with a source. It's nothing fancy, but it will show you the meaningful steps. So go to the browser. Okay, so life cycle. So I've got the console up, so we'll hit those debuggers. I'm going to refresh to make sure I've got the right one. So we start load. First thing that happens, and again, we're going to review the generated code in a component. The first thing that happens, actually I'm going to do this in conjunction. Let's open up the JavaScript file. So when your web component is, when you create a web component, this is pretty much outside of this section here. This is pretty much, and obviously the debuggers, this is pretty much the skeleton that's put together. The first section you have here that we're looking at now was the first one called, is a shared, I don't know if it has an actual name, but it's a shared area where you can put variables or code that are shared amongst every instance of this web component. And I'll be demonstrating this later on. So that's the first thing that we hit on. I'll hit play. The next thing we hit on is we hit the constructor, which when we go back to Studio, that's this section right here. So this was the second line. This is where we would put code to create a custom function. I'll be demonstrating that. You can call this custom function from outside sources, etc. Again, I'll be going through that again. So that's what's the second opportunity to add script. Let's go to the next step. Next step is the this.load. Now compared to an interface page, this is basically the same thing as an onload event. when your web component loads, the first thing that really gets executed that's not having to do with the construction of the component is the this.load. And you can see that more clearly right here. So this.load, personally, I'll put in any custom code right here under the region namespace declaration. I don't know if there's technically a better place to do that, but that's what I use as best practice. Back to the browser, one more. No, that's it. So what I was expecting the data source to fire. Let me do it again real quickly. So there. Okay. What I don't know what I changed, but after that, the company event. So this is the data source on before current element change would have fired. I must have changed something and messed it up in the meantime. But what I wanted to demonstrate there is you have your this.load, so your on load event, and your data source is not initialized at that point. You need to basically use the data source as the mechanism for finding out when your data source is ready to go, because a lot of times your initializing scripts are dependent upon the data source. So just a tip for you there. Okay, so there's life cycle. Let's go on to the next topic here, and I'm going to speed it up a little bit. We're going to talk about local and global data sources. So this is set in the Properties tab of the data source. I'll show you that. Local data sources maintain a scoped perspective. So when I say local, I'm talking it's within a component, and if you make the data source local, it's going to ignore all outside influences. So you could have on your interface page a data source named company, and also have one inside of your component named company. And they are individual, distinct data sources, and I'll demonstrate that. Global data sources, by contrast, are not affected by component scope. If you had a company data source that was global, regardless of whether you're in a web component or you're in an interface page, it's going to be the same reference regardless. When you're using a local data source, in the last session, you were introduced to $comp, which helps you scope code to your local component. So when you're using a local data source, you're going to need to use $comp.sources instead of just sources in your code. So let's go to the demonstration for this section. I'll close these out. Okay, so local data sources. So what we have here is we have an interface page with a company data source, and you can see in the properties there's no option here for local or global. That's only within a web component you'll see that. I have a grid that has company as its source, and then I have three individual component widgets that are loading the same web component. And it's this web component here, local data sources. And local data sources right now has a company data source, the same name, notice, and I have it marked global. So global is going to ignore, like I said, the local scope. So I'm going to show you directly the differences here in the behavior. So here's the layout. I've got my console up. So I've reloaded, and you'll see here when I click in any of these elements, they all mimic and mirror the behavior. So we've got a common data source that has its own, a single current entity, has a current entity collection, but is common amongst all of these different elements. And the way I'll prove that to you is I'll just go in the console here, and I'll just type in sources. Oops, typo. And when I expand that, you'll see there's exactly one data source called company. Now, by contrast, go back to Studio. Let's make a slight modification here. I'm going to select company, go to the properties, and we're going to make it local. So now this is a self-contained data source, and I'll show you why this is important shortly, but let's look at the difference in behavior first. I'll go to the browser. I'm going to reload. And now we have independently behaving data sources. I can do a different selection. I could do um, a different entity collection per element here. And when I go to the console again, and I put in the same exact thing, sources, you're going to see now instead of one data source, I have four. I have the interface pages data source, and then I have three individual company data sources scoped to their individual web component, or component widget, excuse me. So what I'm saying here, and this should not be new to you if you were through the previous webinar, how it will scope the IDs to be unique based on the parent component, but that's the difference. So a local data source, each component instance has its own data source individually. This is useful for, say for instance, you have a tab view, which I'm going to show you. Maybe you have a detail input, and for each tab, you're going to have a different entity that's being modified. You could open several tabs, and generically, you could have a company data source in each one and have a current element or entity that's different. So this is a way for you to have, by keeping them local, you create the component once, but you have a template, so to speak, for an input form, and you can modify several elements individually. So that's the demonstration of local data sources. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay. So initializing with user data. We're going to pass information to the web component with the onload function. Some typical uses for this. Let's take the last scenario where I said you have a template. You create a new tab, you load into it a detail entry form, and you don't want it to have any old record as the selection initially. You want it to have a specific entity. So user data is a great way to maybe pass in an entity ID to initialize your data source in that web component. You might be send in a variable or an object defining the actual look and feel of the web component. Maybe you programmatically show or hide different elements depending on what type of entity you've sent in, or what's the current entity. The other thing you can do is you can send in a full local structure, data structure. Send in a big object that's very complex. You can send in whatever you like and utilize it how you want. So I'm going to demonstrate sending in user data with the onload. Okay, so let's go to 03 interface page. So I've got some typical use cases here. I'm just going to go through them one by one. You can see where the component widgets are. It's component 2, 3, and 4. And let's start with, and loading into these is the same component each time. It's this one here. All it is a very small input form with a couple of buttons and something to display the current entity. So that will get loaded in. So the first one, if you look back to our data here, because it's going to be working off the same data, is I've got one here called Growth Fund. And what I want to do is I want to load that component and initialize it to bring up Growth Fund. So go back to Studio. I've already put a little bit of script in here. So loading a component, we know it's right there. And I'm going to load in, I've got the path, correct path. I've also put in here just in the comments for ease is I use a UUID for the ID of Growth Fund. That's its UUID. So to pass in user data, it's quite simple. Let's transform this. We're going to actually pass in, it's an object, and the first attribute, so there's our structure now. our first attribute is called path. So our path is the same. We want the same component. Put a comma. Our next attribute is user with a small u, data. And here we pass in an object, and I'm going to pass in init ID for the ID to initialize with, and we're going to pass this string. Okay, so we're going to pass in a user data object with this value. So I'll save that. Now, inside of the component, the web component's JavaScript, I'm going to show you how to access this user data. So you've done a load component, you've passed the ID. You'll see here at this.load you have an argument data, and it's in here. So I'll put, just so you can see it, let's put a debugger and I'll bring it up. But the first thing I want to do on this.load is I want to do a query and find that specific entity. So we'll do $comp, because it's a local data source, .sources.company .query. And let's look for, an ID equal to placeholder1, which will be data.userdata.initID. And that's going to be holding our value. So let's save that, and let's go to the browser and let's try it. So user data, we'll reload. So load growth fund, we should get the debugger. Okay, here's our debugger. And you'll see here, I've already got it, data.userdata. Here's the object. We've got an init ID with the correct ID. So if we run this, there you go. Growth fund group was initialized. And that's how you do that. Very useful. We could do this in, say we had 10 widgets or 10 component widgets on the interface page. We could send in a different ID for each one and initialize with a different entity. Another common use is if you want to send in logical flags, so something that you can take from within your component and make decisions with. So we'll go back to Studio here. Let's go to our interface page. So we'll take this button here, do an on-click, and we can take some of this and copy, paste. I'll need to make a few changes because the component below this button is component 2. Same path. We can keep the same ID. Let's pass in both the ID and a second argument will be industry. And I'm just making this up. Let's say their technology is their industry. So now we're passing in 2 elements. I'll save that. We'll go to the component, take out this debugger because we know how it works now. And so we've got our query. Now with this, we don't want to make any decisions until we probably finish this query. So I'm going to put in an on success. So on success of the query, we'll do a function. We'll bring in an event. But after that, what we're going to do is just going to put a little if, and again, data, which is our incoming parameter, dot user data, dot, what do we call it, industry, does not equal medical. And the reason I'm doing this, if you look at the browser, is I've got a button here, add patient. It doesn't make any sense for a technology company. So this is just, a very simple illustration that maybe you want to change your interface based on your user data. So if it's not equal to medical, that component's ID is add patient button. Now, from the last video, you'll see that right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide it. You'll see I have a problem here, is I actually need to do get HTML ID because we're within a component in order to scope that ID properly. So all that's going to do is return the fully fully realized ID. And again, watch the previous video if you don't know what I'm talking about here. I'll save that. So let's go back to the browser and run this. Reload. Hide if not medical. There we go. Our button's gone. So this is another way. Send in user data that defines certain arguments and make some logical decisions based on those arguments. Okay. Just for time, I'm going to skip the next one, but I'll describe it. This one here, another common use is to send in the context. So when you're programming with components, you want to keep things as loosely coupled as possible. So perhaps you have a component within a component. Quite often, useful information inside of that component would be what the parent component's ID might be. So this would be you could send that in as user data. Here's a more interesting one. Let's send in functionality. So we're in the interface page. Let's actually influence the functionality of this web component by sending in a function. So we'll go to onClick. Again, same loading mechanism. And this will be component 4. Load component, same path. Let's take out this information. And let's pass in this time, instead of, let's pass in do something. And we'll actually pass in a function. And we're going to pass in, just do something simple, just do an alert. This was passed in from the interface page. Okay, so let's go to the browser and let's try that one. So we're actually passing in a function. We're providing this web component a function that it knew nothing about when you created the web component. You can get a lot of interesting ideas that way. What did I do wrong? Oh, sorry, I didn't actually do anything in the component. So we're passing in the function. We have to do something with it here. Let's get rid of all this old stuff. And let's go var my function equals data dot user data dot do something. So that's actually a function. I could just call data dot user data dot do something right away. Best practices, you want to grab your user data out of here right in this area, because without describing it real technically, it disappears at some point. So you're best off to put it into your own variables and deal with it here, get it all set up so that you can use it throughout your component. So we've just put do something into my function. So my function is now a function. So let's just call it my function. Now we'll try it in the browser. Should work better. There we go. This was passed from the interface page. So you can influence your web component based on your load component call by sending in actual functionality. And I thought this has a lot of really interesting possibilities. So there's sending in user data. Okay, let's talk next topic. Shared code in a web component. So you can modify something once and have it available in every instance. So I'm talking about web components here. So you can have a web component respond to outside input across the board. So say, for instance, you're using a web component as a template, and you have 10 of them on your interface page. You can set a value in one of those, and it will automatically show up in every instance of that web component, not widget, web component. So again, you can update web components that are utilized as a template. So let's take a look at this. Close all this old stuff out. And we're into 04. Oh, sorry. You know what? I'm going to cover custom functions first. So there, you'll get told about this twice. Okay, custom functions. Because I'm going to use this functionality, I ordered them incorrectly. So, custom functions. It will provide you a familiar interface to inspire action in your component. it'll create a syntax that you're very used to with the Wakanda API, the $$ component ID, which is the component widget ID, dot your function. And you can create custom functions that you call on your own web components. Now you could create this type of functionality using, and there's in the Learning Center a tech note, I think I wrote it, anyhow it's in there, about creating custom functions on widgets. So you can create this type of functionality on a widget. However, when you do it the method that I'm going to describe here, you can actually create a function per web component, not for the entire component widget. So you can actually create a function that's specific to a web component versus the widget only. And it helps you encapsulate your code inside the component. So you can start, again, it's all about modularity and keeping things in their own package, neatly organized package. Let's go to custom functions. So I have two component widgets, each loading a different web component, and they're both here. The first one is just this button. So what's the best way for me to attack this? Okay, let's just open that components script. So here it is. I have the button already set up here to accept code. Where you create a custom function is in the constructor, right here. So the way you do it is this dot my function, you could name it whatever you want, equals function, and we're going to take in a value, say, and let's just do an alert. The value is plus value. Okay, so it's a function, we've just defined it. Now to call that from within the component is simple, $comp dot my function. That will call it. So that's in the button. Now here's the more interesting part. So we've got this set up. I'm in the interface page. How do I call that custom function on that's inside of this web component from the interface page? So we'll do that. We'll go to events on click, and the idea of it is component one, I'm pretty sure. Let me double check. Yes, component one. So it's just like this. Reference the, now we're on the interface page, so I don't need to get HTML ID. Component one dot my function, and we'll pass in test. So let's go to the browser under 04. Oh, sorry, 05. Okay, so let's try this button. Yes, the value is undefined. Oh, I didn't pass a value from the inside, so that's actually correct. Correct that I made an error. Let's call it from the interface page. The value is test. So we've just called the function on that web component. Okay, let's do the same type of scenario on the second one. So let me open that web component. I'm just going to open, okay, so I already have it set up. Do something completely different with the same interface page call. So this is, I've got it set up already. I didn't do the button. We don't need to call from within. But, so back to the browser, sorry. So this should work right now. Bear with me a second. Figure out where I'm at. Oh, sorry, no. So let's set up the this dot my function equals. Okay, I'll catch up to myself in a second here. Okay, so we actually need to add code to this button. So same thing. It's component 2 this time, except it's not taking a parameter. It's a different function. So we're just going to call my function on web component 2, and this is just to demonstrate that it's a different function entirely. So we've got this one's going to call that long, it's going to alert with the long string with no parameter. This one alerts with the parameter we provide. So we'll go to the browser, refresh, and there we go. Oh, I know what mistake I made. Copy and paste mistake. Back to here. In this code, I left component 1. It's supposed to be component 2. So it was calling the function of component 1 actually. Sorry, let's go back to the browser and demonstrate it actually working. So this one does the web component 1's function, and this one does web component 2's. Now here's where it gets interesting as well. This is a hard-coded button. It's calling my function on this this component widget. I'm going to load this web component into this widget. So there we go. Now I've changed nothing in this button. When I click it, it gives me the correct response based on the web component. So you can create functions that have a name, not have to reprogram this button, and have the web component respond accordingly. So I hope I've demonstrated clearly why this is advantageous, but it's providing you an interface, a mechanism to influence your web component, but inside of the web component, depending what you want it to do, it could do totally different things in different web components. You're able to create an interface and have it react accordingly. So that's how you create custom functions. Now we're going to go back to shared code. I already explained what it was, but let's go back to it for a second. So we're going to modify something once and have it reflected in all instances of that web component. So let's go to, I'll close all these out. And I'm going to really start whipping through this stuff. Okay, shared code. So you can see here I have 4 component widgets with the same component inside, and you can click and alert the value. When I go into that widget, it's this one here. You can see, sorry, wrong one. We're on 04. You can see I'm going to actually no, sorry. What am I doing? There we go. Okay, so this is the skeleton plus a button click. We're going to set a value right here in its, I don't know, called the shared area. I'm going to make a new var shared var equals test. Start with test. Let's go to the browser. Let's refresh. Now if I alert, obviously it's going to do nothing because I didn't do anything. Let's do an alert shared var. So it's just going to alert test. Back to the browser. Okay, so see we've got test from there, test from here, and each one of these has the same value of test. So why that's interesting is we can do something like this now. Let's create a custom function that sets that value. So let's go this dot set shared var equals function, and let's bring in a value, and let's set, so shared var equals value. We'll save that, and it's going to alert shared var. So if I go back to the browser now, reload, so these will all have test in there right now. Let's call that custom function. So let's do it on, this is component 1. component1 dot set shared var, and we'll pass in not test. When I run that, now let's do an alert over here, not test. So you see I've set the value here, and it's common in all of these. So you set it once, all instances of that web component get that value. Now a different web component would not get the value. This is per web component. So you can see this can be very powerful how you utilize it. So that's shared code. Let's see what I've got next here. Dynamic creation. I'm going to show you a real simple example of creating a component on the fly. The most natural example for this is probably a tab view widget, but it gives you some interesting possibilities. So you can create component widgets on the fly. You can load any web component into the widget. So you create the widget, and then you can choose which web component am I going to load into that. So we're actually creating the widget on the fly. The web components are pre-created, created ahead of time. It's useful for tab views and dialogues. So say, for instance, you wanted to bring up, I'm not going to show an example on a dialogue, but you could create a component widget, make it modal, load a web component into it, and then display it. And you're not actually having a dialogue sitting there in your interface page, taking up space. You're only creating it when you need it. And I think dialogues are the other really good use case for creating these things dynamically. By the way, you can create all other widgets dynamically as well. It's not only the component widget. You can create buttons and all of this stuff on the fly as well. So it gives you a lot of possibilities for creative, like dynamic layouts. So what I've done for this is I've actually just, let me show you the browser. I've just got an example running because there's a lot of typing involved for a webinar. So dynamic creation, this is what it's going to do is we can choose our view, and we're going to create a tab and load that view into it. So let's do a company view, create. Let's do a person view, create. And it's creating a component widget for each one. Let's make another person view. So we could have different different current entity, different entity collections, because they're all individual components. Let's create an employee view. So you can see we're creating a tab, then creating a widget inside of that tab, and loading the web component. And I'll show you how this is done. So dynamic creation. So this button is what triggers the functionality. And right here, so I'll just read through it real quickly. Adding a tab, that's pretty straightforward. We're adding it and we're making it closable in this circumstance. We're getting the current tab. The current tab, when you create a new tab, the new tab is automatically the one that's selected. So we get the selected tab. We get the internal container for that tab because we're going to add our component widget to it as a child. So we're getting the ID of that internal container for that tab. We're creating a random DOM ID because when you're creating things dynamically, you need to make sure that your DOM ID is unique. So there's probably better ways of doing this, but I'm just using a random, and I put a C first because your DOM ID cannot start with a number. So it's just a C plus a random number. Then we're creating the actual div. That's the component widget's DOM element. We'll set the ID to the ID we generated. We're appending it to the body, so it's not visible yet. So we do document body append to the body. Then we're actually building the widget. And where you can, these arguments currently are not documented. I know it's on its way, but the way that I usually get these arguments is I'll create the widget in Studio on a test page or something. Let me just show you. So say I wanted to create this button dynamically. is I can go into source and I can find a button wherever it is. There it is. And there's button, and you can see all of these arguments are specified in here, so you can sort of copy and paste and get them into your script. So what you're doing is you're building, it's a little bit different syntax. You're actually building an object that's the widget, and setting the one that's important, obviously, is the ID needs to match up to the DOM ID. Okay, then this line here, we're adding the child to the new tabs container, and then we're loading whatever. I have a string in the combo box that tells us what type of web component we want to load in. So we're just doing a load component and taking the value from the combo box. So that's creating a component dynamically. Let's close that up. So just because we're running a little short on time, I want to have a bit of time for questions. I don't know how much of this I'll actually do. I want to talk a bit about communicating from component to component, web component to web component, because essentially you can hard code everything. You can use fully realized IDs, component 1 underscore this widget, component 2 underscore this widget, to directly reference any of these widgets. But it's not good practice, because the more you do that, the more your code becomes brittle. So there's some better practices communicating one component to the next. Obviously, the first one is use fully qualified IDs. I wouldn't recommend it. The next, and probably a little better approach, is to use a global namespace. So I'll just implement that real quickly. I've got an interface page here we're on. So I'm just going to make a new JavaScript file. Let's call it whatever. And we're going to add that to the scripts for this page. I'll just drag it on. And now probably you would do this type of activity at a more basic level, like right at the base of your application. But just to show you how you do a namespace, is I would do something like this. So say my application's named CRM. You put a unique, generally capitalized string, CRM equals empty object. And then from here you can start building paths. So say I had widget A equals, and then I would put in the full ID in here. Okay, and then in my application, when I'm referencing, say this is widget A, when I'm referencing this widget, I have a string that has the full ID. So I can put this crm.widget, it's a global namespace, so if I put that in anywhere in the application, I'll get full ID as the value. So now I can put this value here, this variable, throughout my application, and if I need to, for whatever reason, change the ID of that widget, I can change it in one place and it doesn't break my code everywhere else. Okay, so I hope I've explained that properly. The other way you can do it, we talked about custom functions. The other idea is you could have getters and setters. So say if you wanted this value within this web component to be set, you could create a custom function that says set. Maybe the function is component2 dot set value 2 and pass in a parameter. That would be another way to do it. The other thing I would suggest is I've created a library. If you really want to get advanced with communicating component to component, I would recommend you look at the WAC library events. And let me bring up a browser here, and I'll show you. So if you just go to, and I'll put this on GitHub. I don't know why I put it on. I've lost my mouse here. Hold on 1 second. Okay. I'm going to put this on GitHub. I don't know why I did it on my own to start with. So in here, and this library needs some work, but in this event section, Um, it's in there. Also, there's something in the Learning Center. But what, in fact, I'd look at the tech note in the Learning Center. It explains it in a lot of detail. What it does is it allows you to communicate between different elements of your application very easily. And so maybe you could have 10 different elements of your page subscribed to a change. And again, that's not the topic of this webinar. But what I would say is go to the Learning Center and take a look at the, let me just go there. Go to wakanda.org, of course. And then the Learning Center. And then Tech Notes. And client-side event system. I'd have a read of this, and I would go to. I'll get that library on the GitHub soon. That's where the most recent version of this library will be. But this has a project in it that's attached. I definitely read that if you're interested in component-to-component communication. Okay, let's finish up. Okay, I used Wakanda 3 for this demonstration. The only thing that you probably want to know about in the dev channel and for Wakanda 4 is you can use asynchronous with the load component. So here's an example of the code. You can have an on success after the load. Now, what would be interesting, as I've not tested it, I'd be interested in knowing what runs first, this code or the code in the this dot load, your on load event of the component. And yeah, it's an interesting guess. I don't know which one will come first. So let me know what you find out. And that is the end. So there's a link to my GitHub, or the GitHub for this project. I'll do a commit with the finished version as soon as this is done. And I'll open it up for questions if anyone has questions.
Hi, Greg. Thanks very much. I did notice one question. Can you see the questions?
No.
Okay, so I'll read them off to you. The first question is, can required SSJS modules be entered in the manifest so they get loaded?
Good question. I don't know the answer, though. I can follow up with that. What I think is a good idea, Bill, is why don't we start a thread on the forum, and I'll dig for this answer, probably ask Alexander his opinion, but I can find out.
All right. I saw a few questions about whether or not this will be recorded. It is recorded. I will provide that video to everybody who was here today, so you should expect an email in the next 24 hours. Do we have, okay, yeah, here's another one. Is there a way for a web component to communicate with two or more web components?
Yes, you can either manually implement this using any of the techniques that I described there, but again, the one, maybe you don't use the library necessarily, but the techniques in the client-side event system, in that sample project, I have an example in there where one component or one event is then transmitted to several components, and it's actually a very slick setup. So I'd recommend get that project, get that library, and take a look. It's explained quite well in that tech note.
Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So at this point, I want to thank you again, Greg. Great job. I want to thank everybody for coming, and happy holidays.
Okay, thank you.